The rain had been falling for 3 days without mercy when Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ashford, rode into the teeth of the storm on the afternoon of October 14th, 1843. He was 33 years old, travelling alone under the guise of a gentleman scholar investigating agricultural practices in the northern counties, a thin disguise that allowed him to move through Yorkshire without the burden of his title or the scrutiny that came with it. In truth, he was hunting corruption. 3 estates in this region had changed hands under suspicious circumstances, each preceded by the convenient death of the previous owner, each leaving widows who either remarried immediately under pressure or disappeared entirely from society. Alexander had learned to trust patterns. Where others saw misfortune, he saw design. Where others accepted coincidence, he suspected conspiracy. And his investigation had led him here, to the rural lands bordering the River Wharfe, where autumn storms turned placid waters into raging torrents that swallowed everything in their path. The road had become a river itself, water streaming across the packed earth in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. Alexander's horse fought the current, ears pinned back in fear, and he was considering turning back to seek shelter when he heard it, a sound that cut through wind and rain with terrible clarity, a child's scream. Alexander pulled his horse to a halt and strained to see through the downpour. There, perhaps 50 yards ahead, where the road curved near the riverbank, an overturned carriage was being dragged sideways by the current, one wheel still spinning uselessly in the air. The River Wharfe had jumped its banks and claimed the road, and the carriage was losing its battle against the flood. He saw them then, a woman clinging to the carriage door with one arm, while her other arm wrapped around a small child pressed against her chest. Even from this distance, Alexander could see she was failing, her grip weakening, the current pulling at her skirts with relentless hunger. Alexander didn't hesitate. He dismounted, secured his horse to the nearest tree with hands that moved faster than thought, and plunged into the flood. The cold hit him like a fist to the chest, stealing his breath. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, trying to sweep his legs out from under him with every step. He fought forward, using his height and weight to anchor himself, keeping his eyes fixed on the woman who was now barely visible above the churning water. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he knew she likely couldn't hear him over the roar of the flood. The carriage lurched violently, tilting further. The woman's grip slipped. She was going under. Alexander lunged forward, catching her arm just as her fingers lost their hold. The child screamed again, a high, terrified sound that cut straight through Alexander's chest. He pulled them both toward him, wrapping one arm around the woman's waist while she clutched the boy between them with desperate strength. "I've got you," Alexander said directly into her ear, loud enough. "Don't let go of him. I won't let go of you." She nodded against his shoulder, her whole body shaking with cold and fear and exhaustion. Alexander began the agonizing process of fighting back toward the road, each step a battle against current that wanted to claim all 3 of them. The woman was dead weight in his arms, her strength completely spent, but her grip on the child never loosened. When Alexander's boots finally found solid ground, when the water receded from waist-deep to knee-deep to ankle-deep, he didn't stop moving. He carried them both up the muddy bank and kept walking, away from the river, away from the road, toward the dark shape of a building he'd passed perhaps a quarter-mile back, an old hunting lodge, abandoned by the look of it, but with walls and a roof and distance from the flood. The woman in his arms had gone utterly still. For one terrible moment Alexander thought she'd died, but then he felt the flutter of her breath against his throat and the frantic beating of her heart. The child was crying now, quite exhausted, sobs that spoke of terror beyond his young ability to comprehend. "You're safe," Alexander murmured, though he wasn't certain if he was speaking to the woman or the boy or himself. "You're safe now." The hunting lodge door gave way with one solid kick. Inside was dark and cold but mercifully dry, with old furniture covered in dust sheets and a stone fireplace that looked functional despite years of neglect. Alexander laid the woman on the one uncovered settee and immediately turned his attention to the child, a boy of perhaps 3 years, with dark curls plastered to his head and eyes wide with shock. It's all right, Alexander said gently, kneeling so they were eye to eye. You're safe now. Your mother is safe. I'm going to start a fire so you can both get warm. The boy stared at him without speaking, then turned and pressed himself against his mother's side. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were remarkable eyes, Alexander noticed with distant surprise, a deep amber brown that seemed to catch what little light filtered through the grimy windows. She looked at Alexander with confusion that shifted rapidly to fear, then to the boy, then back to Alexander. Who? Her voice came out as barely a whisper, rough and broken. You're safe, Alexander said again, forcing calm into his tone. The carriage went into the flood. I pulled you and your son out. We're in a hunting lodge about a mile from where you went in. The storm is still raging outside, but you're safe here. She tried to sit up and gasped in pain, her hand going to her ribs. Don't move, Alexander said sharply. You may have injuries. Just lie still while I get a fire started and find something dry for you both to wear. He worked quickly, his own sodden clothes clinging to him with an uncomfortable cold. There was wood stacked by the fireplace, dry miraculously, and within minutes he had flames crackling cheerfully, pushing back the darkness and dampness. In a trunk he found old hunting clothes, men's things but serviceable, and blankets that smelled of cedar and disuse, but were blessedly dry. When he turned back to the settee, the woman was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, wariness mixed with something else, calculation perhaps, or fear that had nothing to do with drowning. You need to get out of those wet clothes, Alexander said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. I'll turn my back. There are blankets here, and these... He held up a shirt and breeches that would hang comically large on her small frame. They're not ideal, but they're dry. Who are you? And there was steel beneath the exhaustion in her. Alexander hesitated. The truth was complicated and would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. But lying felt wrong to a woman he'd just saved from drowning. My name is Alexander, he said, choosing partial truth. I was travelling through when I saw your carriage go into the river. That's all that matters right now. You're injured, your son is terrified, and you both need warmth and rest before anything else. Alexander, she repeated, testing the name. Her eyes searched his face with uncomfortable intensity, as if looking for deception in his features. Just Alexander? Just Alexander, he confirmed. And you are? Another hesitation, longer than his. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. Eleanor. My name is Eleanor. It was a lie. Alexander knew it with the same certainty he knew his own name. The pause had been too long, the delivery too careful. She was hiding something, just as he was. Eleanor, he said, accepting the falsehood, because he had no choice and no right to demand truth when he was withholding his own. And your son. She pulled the boy closer, protective. Thomas. Thomas, Alexander repeated, gentler now. He looked at the child. Hello, Thomas. I'm very glad you're safe. The boy buried his face against his mother's shoulder. I'll turn around now, Alexander said. Get yourself and Thomas into dry clothes. I'll do the same. Then we need to assess your injuries and figure out what to do next. He turned his back and began peeling off his own soaked coat and shirt, listening to the rustle of fabric behind him as Eleanor struggled with her wet dress. He heard her gasp in pain more than once and had to force himself not to turn around and help. I'm done, she said finally, her voice strained. Alexander turned. Eleanor sat wrapped in a blanket with Thomas bundled against her, both of them looking absurdly small in the oversized hunting clothes. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet tangles around her face, and there was a bruise darkening along her left cheekbone that Alexander hadn't noticed in the chaos of the rescue. She was beautiful. The thought arrived unbidden and unwelcome. This was not the time, and she was clearly a woman in trouble, possibly in danger, certainly hiding from something. But the firelight caught in her eyes and the fierce protective way she held her son, and Alexander found himself staring longer than propriety allowed. You're hurt, he said, forcing his attention to practical. May I examine your injuries? Eleanor tensed. I'm fine. You gasped in pain at least 3 times while changing. You're holding your ribs. And that bruise on your face is going to get worse before it gets better. Please, I'm not going to hurt you, but I need to know if anything is broken." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thomas," she said softly to the boy, "go sit by the fire, darling. This gentleman is going to make sure Mama didn't break anything when we fell in the water." Thomas didn't want to move, but Eleanor's gentle insistence eventually won out. The boy shuffled to the hearth and sat hugging his knees, watching Alexander with enormous wary eyes. Alexander approached slowly, as if Eleanor were a wild creature that might bolt. "Where does it hurt?" "My ribs, left side, and my ankle." He knelt beside the settee. "May I?" Eleanor nodded, pulling the blanket aside just enough to expose her left side. Even through the oversized shirt, Alexander could see she was holding herself carefully, breathing shallowly to avoid pain. "I'm going to touch your ribs," he warned. "Tell me if anything feels sharp or broken." His fingers were gentle, professional, pressing carefully along her ribcage. Eleanor hissed when he reached a spot just below her breast, and Alexander stopped immediately. "Bruised, I think," he said. "Possibly cracked, but not broken. You'll need to wrap them for support. And your ankle." Eleanor extended her left foot. Her ankle was already swelling, the skin discolored. "Sprained," Alexander said after careful examination. "Not broken, but you won't be walking on it for several days." "Several days?" Eleanor's voice rose with something like panic. We can't stay here for several days." "You don't have a choice," Alexander said firmly. "The storm hasn't stopped. The roads are flooded. Even if you could walk, which you can't, there's nowhere to go until the water recedes." "You don't understand," Eleanor began, then stopped abruptly, as if she'd almost revealed too much. "Then explain it to me," Alexander said, settling back on his heels. "Why were you traveling in this storm? Where were you going? And why do you look terrified of something that has nothing to do with drowning?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. "That's none of your concern." "It became my concern when I pulled you from a flood," Alexander replied, keeping his voice level despite his growing frustration. "If you're running from something, I need to know. If someone is looking for you, I need to know. Because if they find this lodge—" "They won't," Eleanor interrupted. "No one knows I'm here. No one was supposed to—" She stopped again, pressing her lips together as if physically preventing more words from escaping. Alexander waited. When she didn't continue, he sighed and stood. "All right, keep your secrets. But know this, Eleanor, who won't tell me her surname. You and Thomas are stuck here until you can walk and the road's clear. That means at least 3 days, possibly a week. We'll need food, which means I'll have to ride back to the nearest village and purchase supplies. While I'm gone, you'll be alone and vulnerable. So if there's any danger I should know about, any threat following you, now would be the time to tell me." Eleanor looked at Thomas, then at the fire, then back at Alexander. Something shifted in her expression, a kind of exhausted resignation. "My husband died 8 months ago," she said quietly. "His family, they want control of the estate. They want me to remarry. Someone they choose. Someone who will manage the inheritance until Thomas comes of age." Her hand clenched in the blanket. "I refused, so they're trying to force compliance through other means. Legal pressure, social isolation, threats." It wasn't the whole truth. Alexander could hear the careful editing, the details left unsaid. But it was more than she'd intended to reveal, and enough to explain why a gentlewoman might be fleeing through a storm with a young child. "So you ran," Alexander said. "So I ran," Eleanor confirmed. "The carriage was hired under a false name. We were heading to my cousin's estate in Northumberland, where I thought we'd be safe." Her voice cracked slightly. But the river had other plans," Alexander finished. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he made a decision that would complicate everything he'd come here to do, but which felt inevitable nonetheless. "All right, you can stay here until you're healed enough to travel. I'll bring supplies and make sure you and Thomas have what you need. And I won't tell anyone you're here." "Why?" Eleanor asked, suspicion clear in her tone. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." You don't know if I'm telling the truth. For all you know, I'm the villain in this story, not them." Alexander met her eyes. "Are you?" "No." "Then that's reason enough," he said simply. "I don't like bullies who use the law to prey on widows. I don't like men who think they can force women into marriages through intimidation. And I especially don't like people who frighten children." He glanced at Thomas, who was watching them with anxious eyes. "You needed help. I was there. That's all that matters." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and Alexander had the uncomfortable sensation of being thoroughly evaluated. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried weight beyond simple gratitude. "Don't thank me yet," Alexander replied. "We're trapped together in an abandoned hunting lodge during a storm. You're injured, I'm a stranger, and you're keeping secrets. This could all go very wrong very quickly." For the first time, Eleanor's mouth curved into something that might almost be called a smile. "Is that meant to be reassuring?" "No," Alexander admitted, "but it's honest." "Honest," Eleanor repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose we both need to be that." The irony wasn't lost on Alexander. They were both lying about who they were, both hiding their true names, both concealing their real reasons for being here. But in this moment, with the storm raging outside and Thomas falling asleep by the fire, and Eleanor watching him with amber eyes that held too many secrets, honesty felt like a luxury neither of them could afford. So instead he said, "I'll ride out at first light tomorrow for supplies. Until then, we should both try to rest. You take the settee. I'll sleep by the fire with Thomas." "You can't sleep on the floor," Eleanor protested. "You saved our lives. The least I can do is—" "The floor is fine," Alexander interrupted. "You're injured. You need the settee. It's not up for debate." Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. "You're very stubborn." "So I've been told," Alexander said. He gathered blankets and made a rough pallet near the fire, then carefully lifted the sleeping Thomas and laid him down on the soft nest of fabric. The boy didn't wake, exhausted beyond consciousness. Alexander stood and found Eleanor still watching him. "He feels safe with you already," she said softly. "That's unusual. Thomas doesn't trust easily. He has good reason not to, it sounds like." "Yes." Eleanor's expression darkened. "He does." Neither of them spoke of the other truth hanging between them, that they had just bound themselves together through necessity and lies, that whatever happened next would be built on a foundation of mutual deception, and that when the truth eventually emerged, as truth always did, it would shatter whatever fragile trust they were building in this firelit room while the storm raged outside. But for tonight, at this moment, they were simply two people who had survived drowning, and that was enough. Morning came grey and cold, with rain still falling, but no longer with yesterday's violence. Alexander woke to find Thomas sitting up and staring at him with solemn eyes. "Hello," Alexander said quietly, not wanting to startle the boy. Thomas didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. Eleanor was still asleep on the settee, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been while conscious. The bruise on her cheek had indeed darkened overnight, an ugly purple shadow against pale skin. "Your mother needs to rest," Alexander told Thomas. "Are you hungry?" A small nod. Alexander had nothing to offer except water from his canteen, but he shared it with the boy and felt absurdly pleased when Thomas accepted the offering without fear. "I need to ride to the village to get food," Alexander explained, keeping his voice low. "I'll be gone for a few hours. You need to stay here with your mother and be very quiet. Can you do that?" Thomas considered this gravely, then nodded again. "Good lad." Alexander ruffled the boy's dark curls without thinking, and was surprised when Thomas didn't pull away. "I'll be back before afternoon. I promise." He left Eleanor a note explaining where he'd gone, banked the fire, and rode out into the drizzle. The village was farther than he'd hoped, nearly 2 hours each way, but Alexander made good time and purchased everything they'd need: bread, cheese, dried meat, eggs, milk, tea, sugar, and warm clothes for both Eleanor and Thomas, since everything they'd owned had been lost to the river. The shopkeeper asked no questions, which Alexander appreciated. He paid in coins and left quickly, wanting to return before Eleanor woke and panicked at finding herself alone with Thomas in a strange place. When he returned to the hunting lodge, he found Eleanor awake and attempting to stand despite her injured ankle. She gasped in pain and would have fallen if Alexander hadn't dropped his parcels and caught her. "What are you doing?" he demanded, supporting her weight. "I needed—" Thomas was— Eleanor was flushed with embarrassment and pain. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're injured and trying to walk on a sprained ankle." Alexander helped her back to the settee. "Whatever you need, I'll get it for you. Just tell me." Thomas needed to use the necessary, Eleanor said quietly. "I was trying to take him outside." "I can do that," Alexander said. He looked at Thomas. "Come on, lad. Let's go see to that." He took the boy outside to the old privy behind the lodge, supervised the necessary business, and brought Thomas back inside, feeling oddly domestic about the whole affair. This was not how he'd imagined his investigation proceeding. Eleanor was struggling to hide tears when they returned. "What's wrong?" Alexander asked, alarmed. "Is the pain worse?" "No." Eleanor wiped at her eyes impatiently. I hate being helpless. I hate needing help. I hate that I can't even take my own son to the privy without assistance." Alexander knelt beside the settee. "You nearly drowned yesterday. You have cracked ribs and a sprained ankle. Being temporarily unable to walk is not helplessness. It's the natural consequence of surviving something that could have killed you. Give yourself time to heal." "Time," Eleanor repeated bitterly. "I don't have time. Every day we stay here is another day they could find us. Another day Thomas is at risk." "Who are they?" Alexander asked. "His family, you said. But specifically, who is searching for you?" Eleanor's mouth tightened. She was weighing how much to reveal, and Alexander could see the moment she decided on partial truth. "My late husband's cousin," she said. "He stands to inherit Thomas, if something happened to Thomas. He's been pressuring me to marry him, to give him legal control over the estate, until Thomas comes of age. When I refused, he began making threats, subtle at first, then less subtle. 3 days ago, I received word he'd petitioned the courts to have me declared an unfit guardian. I knew if I stayed, he'd find a way to take Thomas from me. So we ran." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. This was the pattern he'd been investigating. Powerful men using the law to prey on vulnerable widows, using children as leverage, destroying families for financial gain. He'd suspected it was happening here in Yorkshire, but he'd had no proof, no names, no specific cases, until now. "What's his name?" Alexander asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Your husband's cousin." Eleanor hesitated. "Why do you need to know?" "Because if he's as dangerous as you say, I should be prepared in case he traces you here. And because—" Alexander stopped. He couldn't tell her he was investigating exactly this kind of corruption without revealing who he really was and why he was really in Yorkshire. "Because?" Eleanor prompted. "Because I want to help," Alexander finished lamely. "Properly. Not just by keeping you hidden, but by making sure he can't hurt you even if he does find you." Eleanor studied him with those two perceptive amber eyes. "You're not just a traveller, are you? You're something else. Someone else." "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies," Alexander said, deflecting. "That's all you need to know." "Is it?" Eleanor's voice was soft but sharp. "Because you're asking me to trust you with information that could destroy me, while you won't even tell me your full name." She had him there. Alexander stood and moved to the fire, buying time to think. "My name is Alexander Thorne," he said finally, offering the truth about his surname, if not his title. "I'm investigating corruption in northern estates. I have reason to believe several men are using legal manipulation to steal inheritances from widows and children. If your husband's cousin is doing what you describe, he may be connected to the larger pattern I'm tracking. It was more than he should have revealed, but less than the full truth. And it seemed to satisfy Eleanor because some of the tension left her shoulders. "His name is Marcus Whitmore," she said. My husband was Edmund Whitmore, Baron of Thornfield. He died 8 months ago of a sudden illness. The doctors said it was pneumonia, but…" She trailed off. "But you think otherwise," Alexander finished. "Edmund was healthy, strong. He'd never been seriously ill in his life. And then 1 week after he changed his will to leave everything in trust for Thomas with me as guardian, he was dead." Eleanor's voice was flat. Marcus was furious about the will. He'd expected to inherit directly. When Edmund died so soon after changing it, Marcus immediately began making accusations, saying I'd poisoned Edmund, saying I was an unfit mother, saying Thomas needed a proper guardian, meaning him. Alexander's blood ran cold. This was exactly the pattern. Convenient deaths, accusations against widows, legal pressure to force remarriage or surrender of inheritance. "I need you to tell me everything," he said. "Every detail about Edmund's death, about Marcus's behavior, about the estate and the will. If this is connected to what I'm investigating, I might be able to help you, truly help you, not just hide you." Eleanor looked at Thomas, who was playing quietly with a piece of wood near the fire. "If I tell you everything, and you use it for your investigation, people will know I talked. Marcus will know, and he'll make me pay. Not if I'm careful," Alexander said. "Not if I protect your identity. You can be an anonymous source. No one will know the information came from you." "You can't promise that." "No," Alexander admitted. "I can't. But I can promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. Both of you." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she took a deep breath and began to talk. She told him everything about Edmund's sudden illness, the strange symptoms that the doctors couldn't quite explain, the way he'd declined so rapidly, about the changed will and Marcus's reaction, about the months after Edmund's death, when Marcus had systematically isolated Eleanor from society, spread rumours about her character, pressured her to accept his proposal of marriage, about the legal petition to have her declared unfit, and the veiled threats about what might happen to Thomas if she continued to refuse. Alexander listened and took mental notes, his anger growing with every detail. This was the same pattern he'd seen in 3 other estates, the same tactic, the same legal manipulations, and if his suspicions were correct, Marcus Whitmore was connected to the same solicitor who had handled all 3 previous cases, a man named Reginald Blackwood, who seemed to specialize in helping wealthy men steal inheritances through barely legal means. "I need to verify some of this," Alexander said when Eleanor finished. "There are records I need to examine, people I need to speak with." "But Eleanor," he met her eyes, "if what you've told me is true, and if it connects to the other cases I'm investigating, I think I can build a case strong enough to stop Marcus permanently." "How long will that take?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know. Weeks. Possibly months. We can't hide here for months." "No," Alexander agreed. "But you can stay here until you heal. Then I'll help you get to your cousin's estate in Northumberland. You'll be safe there while I continue the investigation. And when I have enough evidence, I'll make sure Marcus Whitmore faces justice for what he's done." Eleanor wanted to believe him. Alexander could see it in her eyes, the desperate hope warring with learned caution. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why risk your investigation to help one widow and child?" "Because you're not just one widow and child," Alexander thought. "You're proof the pattern exists. You're the evidence I've been searching for." But he didn't say that. Instead, he said, "Because it's the right thing to do, and because no one should have to run from men who think power gives them the right to destroy lives." It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Eleanor nodded slowly. "All right, I'll stay until I can walk. You'll help us reach Northumberland. And then," she trailed off, "and then I'll finish what I came here to do," Alexander said. "I'll stop Marcus Whitmore and everyone like him." It was a promise he intended to keep. What Alexander didn't know was that his investigation was about to collide with Eleanor's secrets in ways neither of them could predict, and that the truth they were both hiding would force them to choose between justice and something far more dangerous. The feelings growing between them with every shared meal, every quiet conversation, every moment they pretended to be simply Alexander and Eleanor instead of Duke and Duchess playing at being ordinary. The days acquired a rhythm that felt dangerously domestic. Alexander woke early, rebuilt the fire, and rode to the village for fresh supplies. He returned to find Eleanor teaching Thomas his letters by the hearth, or singing soft songs that made the boy giggle, or telling stories about brave knights and cunning foxes that held both Thomas and Alexander captive. Eleanor's ankle healed slowly. By the third day, she could put weight on it without gasping. By the fifth, she could walk carefully around the room. Her ribs still ached, but the worst of the pain had faded, and with each passing day, the distance between them shrank. It started with small things. Alexander teaching Thomas to stack blocks made from firewood. Eleanor laughing at Alexander's terrible attempt to cook porridge without burning it. Shared glances across the room when Thomas said something unexpectedly wise for a 3-year-old. Then bigger things. Long conversations after Thomas fell asleep about philosophy, politics, books they'd read. Eleanor revealing her sharp mind and sharper wit. Alexander finding himself talking about his work, carefully edited, never mentioning his title, and being surprised by her insight. "You think Marcus is connected to other cases?" Eleanor said one evening, her amber eyes reflecting firelight. "How many others?" "3 that I'm certain of," Alexander admitted. "Possibly more I haven't discovered yet. All in Yorkshire, all within the past 2 years, all following the same pattern. A wealthy man dies unexpectedly, leaving a widow and young heirs. A male relative challenges the will or claims guardianship. The widow either remarries hastily under pressure or disappears." "Disappears," Eleanor repeated. "You mean dies?" "I mean I don't know what happened to them," Alexander said carefully. "The records stop. The women vanish from society. If they're alive somewhere, they're too frightened to come forward." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "And you think you can stop this? One man against however many people are involved in this scheme." "I'm not just one man," Alexander said, then stopped because that was too close to revealing his title. But Eleanor caught it. "No," she said slowly. "You're not, are you? You have resources, influence, more than a simple investigator would have." Alexander met her eyes. "Does it matter?" "It might," Eleanor said. "If you're someone important, someone with real power, then helping me could damage your reputation. Marcus has friends. He's well connected. If word got out that you're sheltering his dead cousin's wife, supporting her claims against him, it could create a scandal that would destroy whatever influence you." She was giving him an out, a chance to walk away before things became more complicated. Alexander should have taken it, should have said, "Yes, you're right. I'll help you reach Northumberland and then we'll part ways." Instead, he said, "Let them talk. I don't care about scandal if the alternative is letting Marcus Whitmore steal a child's inheritance and terrorize his mother." Eleanor's breath caught. "Alexander, besides," he continued, "it's too late to worry about scandal. We've been alone together for nearly a week. Your reputation is probably already in tatters." "My reputation was in tatters the moment Marcus started spreading rumors," Eleanor said. "I'm past caring about that." "Good," Alexander said. "Then we can both stop caring and focus on what actually matters." Their eyes held across the small space between settee and something shifted in the air, thickening with awareness neither of them wanted to acknowledge. "You're a good man," Eleanor said softly. "Better than most I've known." "You don't know me," Alexander, but his voice was rough. "I know you saved my life and my son's life. I know you've cared for us with more gentleness than we had any right to expect. I know you're risking everything to stop men who prey on the vulnerable. That's enough." It wasn't enough. It was built on lies and half-truths and identities they were both concealing. But in that moment, with firelight painting Eleanor's face gold and her amber eyes full of something that looked dangerously like trust, Alexander wanted desperately for it to be enough. He stood abruptly. "I should check the horses." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it, but Eleanor let him go. Outside in the cold October darkness, Alexander braced his hands against the stable wall and tried to remember why falling for Eleanor Whitmore was the worst possible thing he could do. She was a widow in mourning. She was vulnerable. She was his investigation's key witness. She was hiding her true identity just as he was hiding his. And when the truth came out, when she discovered he was the Duke of Ashford, when he discovered whatever secrets she was still keeping, everything fragile they were building would shatter. But telling himself these things didn't make the wanting stop. On the seventh day, Eleanor walked without limping. Her ribs had healed enough that she could move freely. She was ready to travel. Neither of them mentioned it. Instead, Eleanor taught Thomas a new song, and Alexander carved the boy a small wooden horse, and they shared a meal that felt too much like family to be safe. That night, after Thomas fell asleep, Eleanor broke the careful silence they'd been maintaining. "We need to talk about what happens next." Alexander had been dreading this conversation. "You need to get to Northumberland, to your cousin's estate where you'll be safe." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "But I don't want—" She stopped, started again. "I know this has to end. I know we have to leave. But I need you to understand something first." "What?" Eleanor drew a breath. "I haven't felt safe in 8 months. Not since Edmund died. Every day has been fear and vigilance and wondering when Marcus would make his next move. But here, with you, I've felt—" She struggled for words. "Thomas has smiled more in 7 days than he has in 8 months. He's not afraid anymore, and neither am I. Eleanor, I know it's not real," she continued. "I know this is just a temporary shelter from a storm. I know that when we leave here, everything will be complicated. But I needed you to know that these 7 days have mattered, that you've mattered." Alexander couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. "And I need to tell you the truth," Eleanor said. "The whole truth." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "My name isn't really Eleanor. I mean, it is, but it's not the name I usually use. I'm not just Edmund's widow. She took a shaking breath. "I'm the Duchess of Thornfield. Edmund was a duke, not a baron. I lied about that because I was afraid if you knew the truth, I don't know, treat me differently. Or worse, decide I was in too much trouble to help." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward with implications Alexander was still processing. Duchess. She was a duchess. And she'd been hiding it the same way he'd been hiding being a duke. "Say something," Eleanor whispered. Alexander laughed. He couldn't help it. The irony was too perfect, too absurd. "You're laughing," Eleanor said, hurt and confusion mixing in her voice. "I'm sorry," Alexander managed. "I'm not. It's just—" He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness. "You're a duchess." "Yes." "And you've been hiding it." "Yes." "Because you thought I'd treat you differently if I knew." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was small. "Are you angry?" "No," Alexander said. He turned to face her. "I'm not angry, Actually, I'm relieved." "Relieved?" "Because I've been hiding the truth too," Alexander admitted. "My name is Alexander Thorne, and I'm the Duke of Ashford." Silence. Complete, ringing silence. Then Eleanor started laughing too. A slightly hysterical sound that she tried to muffle behind her hand so she wouldn't wake Thomas. "We're both dukes," she said when she could speak again. "Technically you're a duchess," Alexander corrected. "Technically you're insufferable." But Eleanor was smiling and relief was clear in her face. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Same reason you didn't tell me. I thought it would complicate things. I thought you might not trust me if you knew I had the kind of power and influence that could be used against you. And instead, we've spent a week lying to each other. Spectacular, isn't it?" Alexander moved back to sit near the settee. "Though in fairness, we were both telling partial truths. I am investigating corruption. You are being hunted by your late husband's cousin. We just edited the details." "Rather significantly," Eleanor pointed out. "Rather significantly," Alexander agreed. He studied her face. "Does this change things? Between us?" Eleanor considered. "I don't know. Does it?" "It should," Alexander said honestly. Society has expectations about how dukes and duchesses behave. We're not supposed to meet by fishing each other out of floods. We're supposed to be introduced at balls, go through proper courtship, have chaperones and calling hours and all the elaborate rituals that ensure nothing improper happens. Nothing improper, Eleanor repeated, and something flickered in her eyes. Is that what you want? Proper? No, Alexander admitted. What I want is wildly improper and completely inadvisable. Tell me anyway. Alexander held her gaze. I want to keep you here. I want to forget about Marcus Whitmore and investigations and danger. I want to pretend we're just Alexander and Eleanor, not the Duke and Duchess, just two people who found each other in a storm and decided to stay. That's impossible, Eleanor whispered. I know. We both have responsibilities, estates. People depend on us. We can't just disappear. I know that too. And you're investigating my husband's death. My estate might be evidence. I might be evidence. This is all tangled together in ways that make any kind of relationship between us incredibly complicated. Yes, Alexander said. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Completely inadvisable, Eleanor agreed. Wildly improper. Absolutely impossible. They stared at each other across the small space that separated them. Then Alexander said, I'm going to kiss you now. If you don't want that, if it's too much or too soon or too complicated, tell me to stop. Eleanor didn't tell him to stop. Alexander crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, cupped her face in his hands with the same gentleness he'd shown since pulling her from the river, and kissed her. It was soft at first, careful, as if they were both afraid of breaking something fragile. Then Eleanor's hands came up to grip his shoulders, and the kiss deepened into something urgent and desperate, and months of loneliness, seeking comfort in connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against Eleanor's. This is still a terrible idea, he murmured. The worst, Eleanor agreed. We should stop before it gets more complicated. We absolutely should. Neither of them moved. One more, Eleanor whispered. Just one more, and then we'll be sensible. Alexander kissed her again, and they both knew one more would never be enough. They left the hunting lodge on the 10th day, both of them reluctant, both of them knowing they couldn't hide forever. Alexander had arranged for a carriage. Eleanor couldn't ride with her still healing ankle, and Thomas was excited about the adventure, even though he didn't understand why they were leaving. The journey to Northumberland would take 3 days, 3 more days of being together before Eleanor disappeared into her cousin's estate, and Alexander returned to his investigation. 3 days before everything became impossible. They stopped at an inn the first night, taking separate rooms for propriety's sake, though Alexander wanted nothing more than to forget propriety entirely. Eleanor put Thomas to bed and then appeared at Alexander's door, wrapped in a dressing gown and looking uncertain. I can't sleep, she said. Alexander stepped aside to let her in. They sat by the window, watching rain streak the glass, and talked until dawn about everything and nothing. About Edmund and what their marriage had been. Respectful, affectionate, but not passionate. About Alexander's parents and the expectations that came with being a duke. About Thomas and what kind of future Eleanor wanted for him. About the investigation, and what would happen when Alexander had enough evidence to move against Marcus Whitmore. When this is over, Alexander said as pale light began filtering through the window. When Marcus is dealt with and you're safe, don't, Eleanor interrupted. Don't make promises about after. We don't know what the after will look like. I know I want you in it, Alexander said. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. You don't want that. I'm a duchess with a young heir and an estate to manage, and a scandal that will follow me everywhere. You're a duke with your own responsibilities and reputation. If this became public knowledge, the gossip alone would be devastating. I don't care about gossip. You should, Eleanor said. Your work depends on credibility. If you're seen as someone who took advantage of a vulnerable widow, who compromised her while she was injured and dependent on you, everything you're trying to accomplish will be dismissed. They'll say you're not investigating corruption. You're just a man who wanted... She stopped. Wanted what? Alexander asked. Me, Eleanor whispered. They'll say you wanted me and use the investigation as an excuse to get close, but that's not what happened, isn't it? Eleanor stood and moved toward the door. Think about it, Alexander. The timing of this. The way we met. The fact that my husband's death fits the pattern you're investigating. If you pursue both me and the case against Marcus, people will assume the worst. They'll assume you're biased. They'll assume every piece of evidence you present is tainted by personal involvement. And Marcus will use that to destroy both of us. She was right. Alexander knew she was right, but he couldn't accept it. So what are you suggesting? He asked. That we pretend this didn't happen? That we go our separate ways and never speak of it again? I'm suggesting we be realistic, Eleanor said. This week has been precious, important, but it's not real life. Real life is complicated and messy and full of politics and expectations. In real life, you're the Duke of Ashford investigating corruption, and I'm the Duchess of Thornfield trying to protect my son from a man who wants to destroy us both. There's no room for anything else. There could be, Alexander insisted. When? Eleanor challenged. After the investigation, after the trial if there is one, after months or years of legal battles and scandal. How long are we supposed to wait, Alexander? How long before we're allowed to be just Alexander and Eleanor instead of the Duke and Duchess? Alexander had no answer. Eleanor nodded as if his silence confirmed everything she'd said. I thought so. She left then, closing the door softly behind her. And Alexander stood at the window, watching dawn break over Yorkshire, and feeling like he'd just lost something precious before he'd even had a chance to claim it. They reached Eleanor's cousin's estate on the third day. It was a modest manor house, well maintained but not grand, with gardens that spoke of careful attention rather than wealth. Eleanor's cousin turned out to be a formidable woman in her 50s, named Margaret Hartley, who took one look at Eleanor and Thomas and immediately swept them inside with the kind of fierce protectiveness that made Alexander relax fractionally. You'll be safe here, Margaret said, glaring at Alexander as if daring him to contradict her. Marcus Whitmore has no influence in Northumberland. If he tries anything, he'll find himself dealing with very unfriendly magistrates who don't appreciate outsiders threatening widows under their protection. Thank you, Eleanor said, embracing her cousin, for everything. Margaret's expression softened. Your family. Of course I'll help. She looked between Eleanor and Alexander, though I'll want the full story eventually. All of it, including whatever happened to put that look in your eyes. Eleanor flushed. There's nothing. Don't lie to me, child. I raised 6 daughters. I know what that look means. Margaret turned to Alexander. You, Duke of Ashford, isn't it? I've heard of your reputation for meddling in things that don't concern you. Alexander started. How did you? I wasn't born yesterday, Margaret said tartly. I know every duke in England by sight and reputation. You're the one investigating the suspicious deaths in Yorkshire. And my cousin here, she gestured at Eleanor, happens to be connected to one of those deaths. Convenient timing, that you were travelling through Yorkshire when her carriage went into the river. Margaret, Eleanor protested, it's not what you think. He saved our lives. I'm sure he did, Margaret said. I'm also sure there's more to this story than a simple rescue. But you're exhausted, child, and little Thomas looks ready to fall asleep standing up. We'll talk later. She turned to Alexander. You, out. Come back in 3 days if you want to speak with Eleanor again. Until then, she needs rest and peace and privacy to recover from whatever ordeal you've put her through. I didn't, Alexander began. 3 days, Margaret repeated firmly. Now go. Alexander looked at Eleanor, who was avoiding his eyes. Eleanor. She's right, Eleanor said quietly. I need time to think. We both do. 3 days won't change anything. 3 days felt like an eternity. But Alexander nodded and left, feeling like he was abandoning something important, even though he knew Eleanor was safe here, safer than she'd been in months. He rode back toward Yorkshire with his mind in chaos, torn between the investigation that had brought him here and the woman who had somehow become more important than any case. When he reached the village where he'd been staying, He found a message waiting from his solicitor in London. It was brief and urgent. Your Grace, information regarding Reginald Blackwood has surfaced. He is connected to 4 estate cases matching your pattern. All 4 involve suspicious deaths. All 4 involve pressure on widows to remarry quickly. Suggest immediate return to London to review evidence. 4 cases, not 3, 4. And if Eleanor's case made 5, there could be more. How many widows had been terrorized? How many children had lost their inheritances? How many men like Marcus Whitmore were preying on vulnerable families? Alexander made his decision. He would return to London, review the evidence, and build the strongest possible case. Then he would come back for Eleanor, not as the Duke of Ashford investigating corruption, but as Alexander who loved her and wanted a future with her regardless of the complications. It would take time, but some things were worth waiting for. He wrote to Eleanor that, explaining his plans, promising to return, asking her to wait. He never received a reply. Alexander spent 6 weeks in London buried in legal documents, witness statements, and the methodical work of building an airtight case against men who thought themselves untouchable. What he discovered was worse than he'd imagined. Reginald Blackwood wasn't just a solicitor who occasionally bent the law for wealthy clients. He was the architect of a systematic scheme to steal estates through manufactured legal crises. The pattern was always the same. Identify a wealthy family where the heir was young and the widow vulnerable. Arrange for the husband's death through methods that looked natural. Then use legal pressure and social manipulation to force the widow into either surrendering guardianship or remarrying someone Blackwood controlled. Marcus Whitmore was one of 5 men currently using Blackwood's services. But the scheme had been running for nearly a decade, with at least 12 estates successfully stolen and their rightful heirs disinherited. The Duke of Wellington himself reviewed Alexander's evidence and declared it sound enough to bring before the Crown. Arrests were prepared, legal documents were drafted. Legal, but they needed one more thing. Testimony from someone who could speak to the methods used, who could describe the pressure and threats and manipulation in detail, that would convince judges these weren't just unfortunate family disputes, but orchestrated crimes. They needed Eleanor. Alexander wrote to her explaining what he'd discovered, what he needed, what testifying would cost her. She would have to come to London. She would have to face Marcus in court. She would have to endure society's scrutiny and gossip and judgment. He promised to protect her through all of it. He promised they would win. He still received no reply. Growing desperate, Alexander wrote to Margaret Hartley directly, asking if Eleanor was well, if she'd received his letters, if she was willing to testify. Margaret's response arrived 3 days later and turned Alexander's world upside down. Your Grace, Eleanor received your letters. She read them. Then she burned them and forbade me from mentioning your name in her presence. I don't know what happened between you, but I know my cousin well enough to recognize heartbreak when I see it. She believes you used her for your investigation. She believes every kindness you showed was calculated to gain her trust, so she would provide evidence against Marcus. She believes you never cared for her at all, that you were simply doing your duty as a duke investigating corruption. I tried to tell her she was wrong, but she wouldn't listen. She says she won't testify. She says she won't help you. She says she wants nothing more to do with the Duke of Ashford or his investigation. If you care for her as I suspect you do, you need to come here and explain yourself. Letters won't be enough. Margaret Hartley Alexander stared at the letter feeling like he'd been punched in the chest. Eleanor thought he'd used her, thought every moment they'd shared had been manipulation rather than genuine feeling. How could she believe that? After everything they'd shared, after he'd told her he wanted a future with her, after she'd kissed him like he was the answer to questions she'd been afraid to ask. How could she think it had all been lies? But even as Alexander raged at the unfairness of it, another part of him understood. From Eleanor's perspective, the timing was damning. He'd rescued her at the exact moment when her case perfectly fit his investigation. He'd asked detailed questions about Edmund's death and Marcus's behavior. He'd promised to help her. then immediately returned to London to build a case that required her testimony. It looked like he'd befriended her, earned her trust, possibly even seduced her, all to gain a cooperative witness, and Eleanor had been used before. Marcus had used her grief and vulnerability to try controlling her. Of course, she would see patterns of manipulation, where Alexander had thought he was showing love. He had to fix this, had to make her understand that whatever his investigation required, his feelings for her were real and had nothing to do with evidence or testimony or duty. Alexander left for Northumberland the next morning, pushing his horse hard, covering the 3-day journey in 2. He arrived at Margaret Hartley's estate near midnight, exhausted and desperate, and was met at the door by Margaret herself, looking unsurprised. "I expected you sooner," she said. "Is she awake?" "No. And you're not waking her at midnight like some romantic fool. You'll wait until morning, and you'll speak to her properly, and if she tells you to leave, you'll leave." "Understood." Alexander wanted to argue, wanted to demand immediate access, and storm through the house until he found Eleanor and made her listen. But Margaret's expression made it clear that trying any of that would get him thrown out bodily, despite her age. "Understood," he said. Margaret showed him to a guest room and left him to pace and rehearse what he would say, and generally drive himself mad with waiting. Dawn came too slowly and too fast. Alexander was in the breakfast room before anyone else, drinking terrible coffee and trying to calm his racing heart. Eleanor appeared in the doorway at 7 o'clock. She stopped when she saw him, her face draining of colour. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk." "No, we don't." Eleanor turned to leave. "Please," Alexander said, and the raw desperation in his voice made her pause. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. If after 5 minutes you still want me to leave, I'll go and never bother you again." Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, clearly torn. Then she stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, but remained standing near it, as if ready to flee. 5 minutes, she said coldly. "Starting now." Alexander stood. "Margaret showed me your letter. She said you think I used you for the investigation, that you think everything between us was calculated manipulation to gain a cooperative witness. Wasn't it?" Eleanor's voice was brittle. "You rescue a widow whose husband's death fits your pattern perfectly. You ask detailed questions about the circumstances. You promise to help, then immediately return to London to build a case that requires my testimony. It's a very tidy investigation, Your Grace. I congratulate you on your thoroughness. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like?" Eleanor's eyes blazed with hurt and anger. "Explain to me how I'm supposed to interpret the timing. Explain how I'm supposed to believe you actually cared when everything you did advanced your investigation." "I did care," Alexander said. "I do care." "Eleanor, yes. Your case fits the pattern I was investigating. Yes, I asked questions that helped build evidence, but that's not why I kissed you. That's not why I sat up all night talking with you about everything except the investigation. That's not why I wrote you letters begging you to wait for me. You wrote those letters because you need my testimony. I wrote those letters because I'm in love with you." The words burst out louder than Alexander intended, echoing in the quiet breakfast room. "I'm in love with you, Eleanor. Completely, irrevocably, in a way that has nothing to do with investigations or testimony or duty." Eleanor's breath caught. "You can't—" "Yes, I can," Alexander interrupted. "I fell in love with you while watching you teach Thomas his letters. I fell in love with you while listening to you talk about philosophy at midnight. I fell in love with you when you laughed at my terrible cooking, and when you trusted me enough to tell the truth about who you were. None of that had anything to do with Marcus Whitmore or evidence or cases." "Hey, but you still need my testimony," Eleanor said, and her voice cracked. "You still need me to come to London and face Marcus in court and relive all of it publicly so you can win your case." "Yes," Alexander admitted. "I do need that. The case is stronger with your testimony. But Eleanor," he took a step toward her, "I would choose you over the case. If you told me right now that you'll only stay with me if I abandon the investigation entirely, I would do it. If you said testifying would hurt you too much, I would find another way. You matter more than any case. You can't mean that. I absolutely mean it. Alexander moved closer. I spent 6 weeks in London building evidence, and all I could think about was getting back to you. I don't care about scandal or propriety or what society thinks. I care about you and Thomas and the possibility of a future together. That's all. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I want to believe you. Then believe me. Alexander closed the remaining distance between them. Eleanor, I know the timing is suspicious. I know everything about how we met, and what came after looks calculated. But I swear to you on everything I hold sacred. My title, my estates, my honor. I never used you. You were never part of the investigation to me. You were just Eleanor, the woman I fell in love with despite every reason I shouldn't. We barely know each other, Eleanor whispered, but she didn't pull away when Alexander took her hands. I know you're brave enough to run into a storm to save your son. I know you're clever enough to see through lies even when you want to believe them. I know you're kind enough to forgive me for being an idiot about letters and investigations and not explaining properly that I was coming back for you, not just for testimony. He squeezed her hands gently. And I know that when you kiss me, the whole world stops mattering except the two of us. That's enough. We can learn the rest. Eleanor was crying now, tears streaming down her face. If I do this, if I come to London and testify and we try to build something together, it will be the scandal of the decade. Society will assume exactly what I feared. They'll say you compromised me, that I'm trading testimony for your protection, that we're both manipulating the situation for personal gain. Let them say it, Alexander said. Let them gossip and speculate and judge. We'll know the truth. That's all that matters. Is it? Eleanor searched his face. Can we really build something lasting on a foundation of scandal and suspicion? People have built marriages on far less, Alexander pointed out. At least we actually like each other. That puts us ahead of half the aristocracy. Eleanor laughed, despite her tears, a watery sound that gave Alexander hope. I don't want to testify. I don't want to face Marcus or relive Edmund's death or have strangers judge whether I was a good wife and mother. I want to stay here, where it's safe and quiet and no one knows who I am. Then stay, Alexander said. I meant what I said. I'll find another way to build the case. But you need my testimony. I need you more. Eleanor closed her eyes. You're making this very difficult. Good, Alexander said. I'm trying to. They stood there for a long moment. Eleanor's hands in Alexander's, both of them suspended between past and future, between fear and hope. Then Eleanor opened her eyes and said, I'll testify, not because you need me to, because I want Marcus to pay for what he did, because there are other widows out there who might be saved if we stop this scheme, because it's the right thing to do. Eleanor, but, she continued firmly, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me and for Thomas and for the woman I want to be. Someone brave enough to fight instead of hide. If something develops between us during or after the trial, if this thing we started becomes something real and lasting, it will be because we chose it freely, not because I owed you, not because you rescued me, just because we want each other despite all the complications. I can accept those terms, Alexander said. Though for the record, I already want you despite all the complications. The complications haven't even started yet, Eleanor warned. Wait until we get to London and you see what society does with a duke who champions his key witness. Wait until the trial when Marcus's solicitor implies I seduced you to gain your support. Wait until every gossip column in England speculates about exactly when our relationship became improper. I don't care, Alexander said. Eleanor, I've spent my entire adult life doing what society expected. I married the right woman at the right age, and she died before we even knew each other. I've managed my estates perfectly, maintained my reputation, played by every rule, and I've been miserable. Then I pulled a woman and her son from a flood, and for the first time in years I felt actually alive. I'm not giving that up, because society thinks it's improper. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she said, Thomas likes you. It was such an unexpected turn that Alexander blinked. "I'm sorry." "Thomas," Eleanor repeated. "My son. He likes you. He asks about you constantly. He wants to know when Alexander is coming back. He's never attached to anyone this quickly, especially not men. After Edmund died, Thomas wouldn't let any man near him for months. But with you, he felt safe immediately. He's a remarkable child," Alexander said, unsure where this was going. "He needs a father," Anna continued. "Not just a duke who marries his mother out of obligation or scandal. A real father who will care about him and protect him and teach him to be a good man. Can you be that?" "Yes," Alexander said without hesitation. "Eleanor, I already care about Thomas. I have since the moment he grabbed my hand at the hunting lodge and trusted me to keep him safe. If you give me the chance, I will be the father he deserves. Even though he's not your son? Even though he's Edmund's heir and carries another man's name?" "He's your son," Alexander said. "That makes him precious to me regardless of bloodlines or names or inheritance. If you let me into your lives, I will love Thomas as if he were my own. I promise you that." Eleanor's tears started again. "You keep making promises I desperately want to believe." "Then believe them," Alexander urged. "Eleanor, I know I haven't given you much reason to trust me. I know the timing of everything looks suspicious, and I know I made mistakes by not explaining properly what I was doing in London or why I needed your testimony, but I'm here now. I'm telling you the truth. I love you. I want to marry you. I want to be Thomas's father. And I want to build a life with you that has nothing to do with investigations or duty or scandal, and everything to do with choosing each other every single day." "That's a very pretty speech," Eleanor said, but she was smiling through her tears. "It's the truth," Alexander insisted. "I know." Eleanor pulled her hands free from his, and Alexander's heart sank, thinking she was about to reject him. But instead, she cupped his face in her palms and kissed him. It was different from their kisses at the hunting lodge. Those had been desperate, stolen, shadowed by uncertainty. This was a choice made in full daylight, with a clear understanding of what it meant. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor said, "I love you too. I've been trying not to for weeks because it seemed too complicated and too dangerous and too impossible. But I do. I love you, Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ashford, investigator of corruption, terrible cook, and the man who saved my life." "Eleanor Whitmore, Duchess of Thornfield," Alexander replied. "Brave mother, sharp wit, beautiful woman, and the person who saved mine right back." They kissed again, and neither of them heard Margaret Hartley open the breakfast room door, look at them, smile with satisfaction, and quietly close it again to give them privacy. The trial began on a cold January morning in 1844, exactly 3 months after Alexander had pulled Eleanor from the flood. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness what the papers were calling the scandal of the decade, a duke publicly championing a widowed duchess who was accusing her late husband's cousin of conspiracy to commit murder. Marcus Whitmore sat at the defendant's table looking supremely confident, surrounded by expensive solicitors who clearly believed they could destroy Eleanor's credibility and paint Alexander as a besotted fool who'd been manipulated by a clever woman. They were wrong. Eleanor's testimony was devastating in its clarity and detail. She described Edmund's sudden illness, the strange symptoms, the rapid decline. She produced letters from Marcus pressuring her to remarry, threatening to take Thomas, spreading rumours about her character. She calmly explained his petition to have her declared unfit and the legal manoeuvring designed to steal her son's inheritance. Marcus's solicitors tried to shake her, tried to imply she was lying for attention or motivated by grief or being coached by the Duke of Ashford, but Eleanor remained steady, answering every question with precise honesty that left no room for doubt. Then, Alexander's solicitors presented the evidence he'd gathered: financial records showing payments from Marcus to Reginald Blackwood, witness statements from men who'd been hired to spread rumours about Eleanor, medical records that raised questions about Edmund's death, and, most damning, testimony from 2 other widows who had been targeted by the same scheme and had finally found the courage to come forward. The defence crumbled. Marcus's confidence evaporated. And when the verdict came down 3 weeks later, it was unequivocal. Guilty of conspiracy to defraud, guilty of attempted theft of inheritance, guilty of criminal harassment. Marcus Whitmore was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Reginald Blackwood received 20 years, and 3 other men involved in the scheme faced various sentences that ensured none of them would ever terrorize widows again. Eleanor stood in the courtroom and watched justice being served, and felt something heavy lift from her chest that she'd been carrying since Edmund's death. "It's over," Alexander said quietly beside her. "It's over," Eleanor agreed. But of course, it wasn't. The trial's end meant the scandal's beginning. Society had opinions about the Duke of Ashford and the Duchess of Thornfield. Loud opinions, extensively published opinions. The gossip columns had a field day speculating about exactly when the Duke had become romantically involved with his key witness, whether he'd compromised her during her recovery from the flood, whether she'd seduced him to gain his protection. The more conservative papers condemned them both as examples of moral decay among the aristocracy. The more liberal papers celebrated Alexander for his crusade against corruption, but questioned his judgment in forming an attachment to someone so closely connected to his investigation. Invitations to society events dried up for both of them. Old friends became distant. Mothers with eligible daughters made it clear the Duke of Ashford was no longer welcome in their drawing room. "Well," Alexander said one evening in his London townhouse, where Eleanor and Thomas were staying until the scandal died down, "we're officially social pariahs. How does it feel?" "Surprisingly liberating," Eleanor admitted. She was curled up on the sofa, with Thomas asleep against her shoulder, while Alexander sat nearby reviewing correspondence. "I spent 8 months terrified of what Marcus might do, then 3 months preparing for trial, and now I'm being judged by people whose opinions I don't actually care about. It's almost restful." "Restful," Alexander repeated with amusement. "Most people don't find being the subject of society's worst gossip restful. Most people care what society thinks," Eleanor pointed out. "I've discovered I mostly don't. As long as Thomas is safe and we have each other, the rest is just noise." Alexander set down his correspondence and moved to sit beside her. "Thomas is definitely safe. I've had my solicitors secure his inheritance permanently, with protections that prevent anyone from challenging his rights again. Marcus can rot in prison, but he can't touch your son." "Our son," Eleanor corrected softly. "If you meant what you said about being his father." "I meant it," Alexander said. He touched Thomas's dark curls gently. "Though we should probably make it legal. Both the being his father part and the being your husband part." Eleanor's heart kicked. "Is that a proposal?" "That depends. Would you say yes if it was?" "That depends. Are you asking because you want to, or because you think you should after the scandal?" "I'm asking because I love you," Alexander said. "I'm asking because I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I'm asking because Thomas deserves to have both parents legally recognized. And yes, I'm asking because marrying you will stop at least some of the gossip about whether we're living in sin." "How romantic," Eleanor said dryly. "Would you prefer I get on one knee and recite poetry?" "God, no, I've read your poetry. It's terrible." Alexander laughed. "Then what would you prefer?" Eleanor shifted carefully so as not to wake Thomas. "I prefer honesty, so here's mine. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because of scandal or propriety or gossip, because I love you. Because you're good and kind and brave enough to fight corruption even when it costs you. Because you saved my son's life and then became the father he needed. Because when I'm with you, I feel like myself instead of like the Duchess of Thornfield playing a role." "Eleanor, I'm not finished. I'll marry you, Alexander, but I need you to understand what you're getting. I'm a widow with a traumatized child and an estate that needs massive reorganization and a reputation that's been shredded by scandal. I come with baggage and complications and a son who will always be Edmund's heir, not yours. If you want something simple and uncomplicated, you should find someone else." "I don't want simple," Alexander said. "I want you, all of you, baggage and complications and Thomas and estates and everything that makes you who you are. Eleanor, I'm not asking you to be anything except yourself. That's all I've ever wanted. Then yes, Eleanor said. Properly yes. I'll marry you, Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ashford, and I'll try very hard not to create any more scandals. I make no such promises, Alexander said. I plan to create at least 3 more scandals before the year is out. 3? Well, marrying you is 1. Adopting Thomas as my legal son is 2. And I'm thinking of starting a foundation to protect widows from exactly the kind of predatory behavior Marcus engaged in. Society will hate that. Eleanor started laughing. You're going to be a very inconvenient husband. You'll be a very inconvenient wife, Alexander countered. We'll be perfectly matched. He kissed her then, careful not to jostle Thomas. And Eleanor thought that maybe scandal wasn't so terrible if it came with love and partnership and a future that looked nothing like the safe, conventional life she'd once thought she wanted. They married in March, quietly, in a small chapel with only Margaret Hartley and a handful of close friends in attendance. Thomas served as ring-bearer and took his duties very seriously, walking up the aisle with careful concentration, while holding the cushion that bore their wedding band. Society was appropriately scandalized. The papers published lengthy opinion pieces about the moral state of the aristocracy. Several very proper matrons fainted dramatically in their drawing rooms while discussing the shocking speed with which the Duke and Duchess had wed. Alexander and Eleanor ignored all of it. They spent their honeymoon at Alexander's country estate, a sprawling property in Sussex that Thomas immediately claimed as perfect for adventures. Eleanor began the work of reorganizing Thornfield's estate management from afar, discovering that Edmund's cousin had been embezzling funds for years and that restoring the estate to proper function would take time and significant effort. Alexander continued his anti-corruption work, but now with Eleanor as partner rather than witness. Her insights into how men like Marcus operated proved invaluable, and together they helped establish legal protections for widows that prevented the kind of systematic exploitation Alexander had uncovered. Thomas thrived. Within months of the wedding, he was calling Alexander Papa without prompting, and the joy on Alexander's face every time he heard it made Eleanor's chest ache with happiness. You know, Eleanor said one evening as they sat together in Alexander's study while Thomas played with wooden soldiers on the carpet, a year ago I was running for my life with no hope and no future beyond survival. And now, Alexander prompted. Now I have everything I never dared to want, Eleanor finished. A husband I love, a son who's safe and happy, purpose beyond just existing. How did this happen? I pulled you from a flood, Alexander said. Then you pulled me from a different kind of flood. The kind where you're drowning in duty and expectation and loneliness even while surrounded by people. We saved each other, Eleanor. That's all. That's everything, Eleanor corrected. She moved to sit beside him, and they watched Thomas play while evening light filtered through the windows, and neither of them mentioned that they'd both been hiding their true identities when they met, that their relationship had started with lies and half-truths and mutual deception. Because the truth they'd found together was more real than any lie. The life they'd built was more solid than any foundation of perfect honesty could have created. They were Duke and Duchess. They were Alexander and Eleanor. They were partners and lovers and parents and friends. And they were proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances, that love can grow in the space between truth and lies, and that two people who start by hiding from each other can end by being the only ones who truly see each other completely. 3 years later, when Thomas asked how Mama and Papa had met, they told him a story about a flood and a rescue, and 2 people who saved each other without knowing they were both wearing crowns. And it was true, just not the whole truth. But some truths are too complicated for children, and some truths don't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Alexander and Eleanor knew who they were. They knew how they'd found each other. They knew that underneath titles and estates and all the weight of their positions, They were simply two people who had chosen each other despite every reason they shouldn't, and that was enough. Rest well, knowing that sometimes we hide who we are to protect us, and sometimes the person we're hiding from is the only one who can truly see us. Know that rescue comes in many forms, that love can grow from deception if the foundation underneath is genuine, and that the truest thing about us is often the thing we're most afraid to reveal.